On behalf of ReNew Foundation, the philanthropic arm of ReNew Power, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all the distinguished panelists and the authors who joined this webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on global businesses with significant exposure to China. This webinar is being organized in association with the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. Thank you for the partnership. The last time each of us met, it was a physical meeting. And that, as we speak, ironically, seems like a dream now. So these are really trying times. And one thing we are all learning together is that, we have to be resilient. Today's topic, I believe, is a highly relevant one, an interesting one. And as economies and countries look to reboot following the COVID-induced shocks, COVID-19 has clearly ravaged economies and also put China under the scanner. With Sino-US trade war intensifying and escalation of Indo-China border tensions, several corporations are looking to shift their bases out of China in a bid to de-risk. All this is bound to have ramifications on global commerce. We're going to see new ties, new equations, fresh opportunities. Countries and businesses will have to adapt quickly to this new normal as they rebuild. Without further delay, let me introduce our esteemed panelists. First up, I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Kant, the dynamic CEO of NITI Aayog, India Apex Policymaking Institution. He needs absolutely no introduction, as he has been entrusted with the responsibility of framing policies that will help realize our Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji's vision of inclusive and sustainable growth. With his famous infectious energy, he has been championing brand India on the global stage and driving a series of reforms that have helped India significantly improve its position in global ease of doing business rankings in a consistent manner over the years. He's one of the key architects of several pioneering initiatives such as Make in India, Startup India, Incredible India, and the list is long. Clearly, he's played a significant role as India gets positioned as a manufacturing hub, entrepreneurial hub, and a tourism hub. So many feathers on his hat. We are just delighted to have you with us, Mr. Kant. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, my pleasure.
Next up, we have Dean Janow. Dean Janow is the Dean of Sumant and my alma mater. And we are just absolutely delighted to have you with us, Merit. It's just wonderful to be seeing you. We meet often, but unfortunately, I'm not sure when that's going to be next. But your expertise in international trade, your role as a Deputy Assistant Trade Representative of the US for Japan and China, and all the negotiations you've done on more than a dozen of trade agreements, they're all going to add significant value to this conversation. There could be no better person than you to talk about the impact of US-China trade war, how it has affected technological collaborations between the two nations, the future of international trade and globalization in the post-COVID era, amidst concerns that countries are likely to impose barriers and move away from free trade. Your views on whether corporations would now try to localize their supply chains as a good practice and what this would mean for the three big powers, China, US, and India. We welcome and can't wait to get your insights on this, Merit. And thank you for joining us quite early in the morning from your side of the world. Thank you.
Privileged to be with you. Thank you.
We're also joined today by Dr. Anju Seth, who is our co-host and director of IIM Calcutta, of course, one of India's premier business schools. IIM Cal is also Sumant's alma mater, and we are also keen to hear about your perspectives Dr. Seth, on strategy and international business and the implications of potentially severing trade ties with China. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Vaishali. Pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted that IIM Calcutta is co-hosting this event with ReNew Power.
Absolutely, it's an honor, Dr. Seth. The next panel is Dr. Aghi, who is the President and CEO of USISPF, the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, and again, someone who's been working tirelessly with US and India businesses on trade-related issues, with the elections around the corner in the US and the impact this could have in the Indo-US relations and the new equations, and all these perspectives and insights will be very valuable from you, Mukesh. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, it's quite early your time there. Last but not the least, we have Sumant joining us from ReNew. ReNew is India's leading renewable energy company. With the last decade, ReNew has built an aggregate RE portfolio of 10 gigawatts. I'm a part of the team. It's always a delight to grow this company from strength to strength. Sumant will talk about an important issue on the Chinese import of raw materials. So without much ado and without wanting to come between this conversation and the audiences, I'd like to hand it over to Sukumar, a veteran journalist, chief editor of Hindustan Times, and he will be holding the reins of this conversation and discussion today. Over to you, Sukumar. Thank you so much for doing this for us. It's I can't wait for the discussion to start.
Thank you, Vaishali. It's a privilege to have a panel as distinguished as this one. I'd like to request anyone who's tuned into this to put themselves on mute and also switch off their video. That way we'll make sure that there are no disruptions. We will have 15 minutes of questions at the end, 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how the conversation goes. So please keep watch. The chat window will open up just around 20 minutes before the session is to end, which will be around 6:40. Send in your questions and we'll try and post them to one of the panelists. I'm going to start with Dean Janow because I think trade is or was at the center of everything before COVID happened. There was this looming US-China trade war. Some would say the trade war was already on. And China, in many ways, has over a period of time become the country with which most nations in the world have a very uneasy relationship when it comes to trade, including India. We've been running a huge deficit with China, for instance, and in many categories, Chinese companies have pretty much supplanted Indian companies, although, of course, they're also an important source of raw materials and intermediaries. Do you think that in many ways, what has happened over the last 6 months, which is really the coronavirus disease, which originated in Wuhan, China, traveled around the world, has roiled economies everywhere, forced companies to start looking at their own industry, at their own supply chains, at ensuring that their businesses aren't disrupted and don't suffer too much? Both of those are happening as we speak. Do you think this can be characterized as a tipping point for global trade, and specifically for China's role in the global trade ecosystem?
Well, thank you very much. It's a great question, very important, and a privilege to be with all of you. Look, I see this as a moment when we're in a period of a major shock brought on by the pandemic. Global trade has dropped significantly, which is usually the case when economies slow. And it's occurring in the context, I think, of growing nationalism around the world and deep sources of geopolitical tension between the United States and China. And, you know, we've seen periods of shocks in our global history in the past, and sometimes in the face of shocks or their aftermath, for example, after the Second World War, the world can move towards greater openness and the creation of expanded international frameworks. But we've also seen in history the opposite can be true, that countries turn inwards. And I think one of the observations of this period that we're in is that we're seeing an acceleration of certain trends. I think we're seeing an acceleration of digitization, for example, which is creating a lot of opportunities for financial inclusion. I think we're also seeing more nationalism and inward-looking approaches, including to production. The pandemic, I think, has revealed and heightened concerns about vulnerabilities that countries have and that come from globalization and lack of control over supply chain. But in my view, very few countries can come anywhere close to producing all that they need, whether goods or services or agriculture. And really the global economy has been the foundation, in my view, of global prosperity. So many countries haven't prepared for the pandemic and their own resources needed to have more buffers. So I guess what I would say that in this context, I do think that the tensions between the United States and China were difficult before the pandemic, and they're continuing and will be, I think, even more difficult going forward. But whether this is a tipping point for globalization itself, I think is yet to be seen. There are opportunities to seize. There are mistakes that can still happen. And so while I'm expecting to see some adjustments in supply chains around the world, I don't think I am prepared to conclude that globalization is necessarily at a fundamental tipping point.
Excellent. You mentioned opportunities, and I think it's a good cue to bring Mr. Kant in. One of the things that we've heard about is that there is at least some proportion of companies that are looking to move out of China for a variety of reasons. India obviously could benefit from this in some ways if those supply chains move here, if we build our own manufacturing capacity. What do you think India needs to do to grasp this opportunity?
Thanks for that fascinating question. I think important thing for India to do is to get the size and scale of manufacturing. At the end of the day, I'm a great believer that globalization actually has lifted vast segments of population above the poverty line. So this is not the end of globalization. Supply chains are very closely interlinked with each other. And therefore, it's very important that if India has to grow and expand, India must become very, very competitive. And the size and scale of manufacturing has to increase. Thirdly, I think India has to identify key sectors where it has competitive strength, and it must create global champions. And those can use the domestic strength of India's market and then use that as a springboard for penetrating global markets. And this has happened in several sectors. India is a key champion of compact car manufacturing. We do a lot of auto component exports. We are a very major exporter of pharma products. And if it wasn't for India, the world would have never got medicine at the right price points. But what India is now doing is that we are building up, because we were heavily dependent on China for some items. And China accounts for about 14% of India's imports. And it's very important that in certain key areas, particularly active pharmaceutical ingredients, components of mobile manufacturing, etc., India must build the supply chain. And one of the key things India has done is now to build this new production-linked incentive schemes across sectors. So we've announced that already for mobile and electronic manufacturing. We've announced this for medical devices and pharmaceutical products. And we are going to take it across many sectors. And that is really the key, that the higher you produce, the greater your incentive. But in the long run, I think in several key areas, particularly intermediate goods, we do a lot of imports from China, particularly in areas like, if you look at plastics, if you look at fertilizers, if you look at electrical machine parts, if you look at, we are a big manufacturer of iron and steel, and yet we import, we do optical, photographic, surgical instruments. And these are areas where India must, which has been consciously done across by a lot of countries, starting with United States and later by Korea and Japan, the infant industry argument, provide tariffs, higher tariffs, but bring them down very sharply within a period of 3 years, so that there shouldn't be protectionism, but you provide the incentive for Indian companies to become highly globally competitive, so that then they could build to size and scale and become extremely competitive for the global markets. And that is really the key. No protectionism, but extremely competitive you have to make Indian industry. And thirdly, we are finding that actually we have free trade agreements with a number of ASEAN countries. And we are finding that a lot of round tripping is taking place from China across these, through these ASEAN countries. So origins of imports need to be crossly checked. But it's not about subjecting yourself to all this, but in the end, benefit for India will really lie if you make India highly competitive. Indian manufacturing must be extremely competitive, as is India's services. For years, we've neglected manufacturing, and we've provided all the subsidies for agriculture. We've kept tax out of the services sector, but you have to really push and provide a great impetus to manufacturing. That is really the key.
Thank you, Mr. Kant. Mukesh, I'd like you to come in now, because clearly there are two dynamics at play here. One is the US-China imperative, and in many ways, if you look at the whole way in which American companies operated in China, they saw China as a huge market. They saw India for at least a significant amount of time as not so much a huge market, but a great resource center, a place from which they could tap IP, they could tap human resources, but China was a much bigger market for them. You look at the big American manufacturing multinationals, Honeywell, GE, for all of them, China was for a long period a much bigger market, and as a result, many of their sourcing bases were also set up in China. Do you see that changing now? What would India need to do to get into this dynamic now? Because I do know that popular sentiment in the US is significantly arrayed against China, much like it is in India. So is there any opportunity for US and India to come closer together at this point in time commercially?
Sukumar, the answer is yes. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for India, US, and not only just India, US, but India and the West to leverage the fissure which is growing between China and rest of the world. You have to look at the shift in geopolitics is going to define global supply chain. Today, if you look at India supplies almost 40% of the generic drugs to the US, bringing almost $30 billion savings to the US government with the low price point, as mentioned by Amitabh. India also imports 70% of its API from China. And what we are looking at is how do you basically deleverage that supply chain and move that API into India or other geographies. That's one. Second is from a US company's perspective. They will not overnight leave China for a couple of reasons. One is if they do mention they're going to move some manufacturing, they get threatened by the Chinese authorities. In every aspect, their life is made difficult. That's one. Two is what we are seeing is US companies will maintain certain amount of manufacturing for the Chinese market. They will move out of China to manufacture for other geographies. And India becomes a natural choice, as I said earlier, from a geopolitical perspective, but also from a market access perspective. You have to understand you have 1.3 billion people. They're spending power is going up day in, day out. You have skilled labor force, which is world-class itself. From a cost basis, India is one of the most competitive. You look at the taxes, and also from an ease of doing business. So we are seeing that shift taking place. You have to give some time as things happen. A classic example will be smartphones. 3 years ago, India was a very small market for manufacturing smartphones. Today, it's become the second largest manufacturer of smartphones in the world itself. I think this government has done a tremendous job giving incentive, trying to encourage companies to move in. So I see the momentum shifting. It will take some time. You have to give 24 to 36 months, but you will see that shift happening in the mid to long term.
Dr. Seth, this is a good opportunity to bring you in because it's not as if China got there by chance, right? I mean, there were various things that China did that ensured that it got its preeminent position in global supply chains. Could you tell us what these were and how easily these can be imitated or emulated by anyone else?
So that's a great question, Sukumar. Thank you. I think we have to position it in the context of China's political economy over time. We cannot forget that the open door policy that commenced in China in 1978 is the history that China has been building on for the last few decades. In the second stage of the reforms here, we saw a privatization, we saw an opening up of a state-owned industry, but in a very targeted fashion and with significant government control and support, which has continued over time. It's interesting to see. One can consider the role of the state as somewhat akin to a multinational corporation. So, for example, the central government could be considered as akin to the corporate headquarters of a multinational corporation. The provincial governments in China could be considered as similar to the regional headquarters in an MNC. And state-owned enterprises could be considered as similar to divisions and subsidiaries. And we have a central government that is coordinating different aspects of the functioning of the economy, including state-owned enterprises as well as private companies, in a fashion that is deliberately orchestrated and organized to deliver economic growth for the Chinese economy as well as to strengthen Chinese corporations. It's a marvel of coordination and collaboration. It's also very idiosyncratic to the Chinese context. And when we think about lessons that we take from China for India, we have to also recognize this is not India. We don't have the same kind of centrally coordinated multinational style headquarters that is calling the shots here. But at the same time, there are numerous lessons that we can take away. So, for example, if we think about the question of markets and demand, large Chinese and private and state-owned corporations have typically had preferential access to the country's more than 1 billion consumers, which I think my co-panelists has already referred to, is an important thing for India to consider, particularly for young industries. I am no fan of protectionism in the long run, but I do believe that nascent industries do require some degree of protection to be able to strengthen themselves and position themselves in the world market. The investment climate in China, let's just go back as to how China not only invited financial investment, but gained much of its technology. The joint venture strategy that China followed to encourage companies from the West, including the US, to form joint ventures in the Chinese context. And by the way, learn the technology of the American companies and learn it so well that in many ways, in many instances, China is in the forefront of some of the leading technologies in the world. So for instance, artificial intelligence and so on, building on the foundation that they created in the early stages of this the JV policy that they put into place. So that it's what can we learn in India from that sort of policy? In the Indian context, encouraging joint ventures for mutual learning, for the ability for the foreign partner, the overseas partner, to learn about this wonderful Indian market and how to do business here, as well as for us to learn about technology and to be able to take ourselves forward in the context of leading edge technologies, but with particular focus in certain industries. Infrastructure-based industries are particularly crucial to build upon. And in the long run, if we think about how can we not just increase our manufacturing capability, but to build our innovative and technological capability so that jointly these can fuel India's growth for the next many decades, is the way I think we could potentially go.
Okay, Dr. Seth, thank you. You've said a lot of things, so I'm going to break the order a little bit and get Mr. Khan to comment on some of them. Because the sense many people have is that when any foreign company gets into a joint venture with China, the control is pretty much with the Chinese. It doesn't matter what proportion of the joint venture you own. And so the Chinese are very focused on making sure that they get what they want from it. And in India, maybe because we are probably far more free market oriented than the Chinese are, especially when it comes to joint ventures, right? I mean, we don't control them with the same iron hand that the Chinese do. Maybe Indian companies aren't really getting so much out of joint ventures. So how do we address this, Mr. Kant, going forward? How do we make sure that we build India's capabilities in key sectors? How do we ensure that we get the right kind of technology? Dr. Seth alluded to the kind of strides that China has made. And yesterday when we were having a conversation, she was speaking about the Chinese approach to IPRs, for instance, right, where they really went out and got them, usually from Western economies. How do we build up our technology base? How do we build up our manufacturing base? How do we ensure that we get the most out of our own joint ventures and partnerships?
So three things. First of all, I think earlier India had made itself very complex, very complicated, and a difficult place to do business in. And India must make itself extremely easy and simple. We've jumped up about 79 positions in the World Bank ease of doing business. Our target is to get into the top 50 this year and get into the top 25 in the next 3 years. I think what has happened across the government is something remarkable. That is the extent of digitization. We've linked all governments very, very effectively. I mean, just to give you an example, direct tax, almost 98.5% of the people pay online, and therefore a huge amount of work has been done on ease of doing business. Secondly, our foreign direct investment regime is extremely open. Almost 98% of the FDI which comes in through the automatic route. You don't need any approval. And I think almost all the sectors have been opened up. And thirdly, my view is that India needs to focus. We tended to allow, if you look at our MEIS scheme, which was pushing out exports, we were supporting a vast number of sectors. Whereas if you look at China, they focus very strongly on a few sectors. And therefore, you need to focus on 8 or 10 areas and create large-scale companies. And once you have large-scale companies, then there is a backward-forward linkage with your MSME sector, and MSME sector then grows. And therefore, size and scale of manufacturing is very critical. And for that to happen, India needs to really get rid of the antiquated labor laws. And that is what some of the states have done post the pandemic. And it's very important that we allow large-scale manufacturing to come in, and a lot of good quality trunk infrastructure has now been created under the DMICDC corridor Auric in Maharashtra, at Dholera. This is all plug and play facility, so people can get in, manufacture to large scale. And fifthly, I think the key point is that now the government has pushed for production linked incentive. The more you produce, the higher your incentive, and you go on getting incentive for 5 years on larger and larger production. So across electronics, across network products, across auto components, this is the strategy which will be pushed for, that you support large scale manufacturing, which will create both job creation as well as bring down the cost of production, enable you to penetrate domestic market, and use that then to get into global markets. That will be the key strategy for India.
Sumant, I'm going to bring you in now because I think there's been a lot of talk about domestic capability, manufacturing in scale, the size of the local manufacturing sector, competitiveness of the local manufacturing sector. How easy do you think this is? Because across sectors, there is still a significant dependency that India has on imports, including from China. If you look at solar, for instance, your own sector, there are a lot of key inputs that come from China. How do you ensure that you build self-reliance, which seems to be the term of the hour, without really disrupting your business interests?
Yeah, thank you, Sukumar. Look, I think that, whatever Mr. Kant has said about building large-sized businesses in India, I think it's absolutely valid. You can't be all things to all people. So I think the government does need to choose certain sectors and then go whole hog for those sectors. Now, let's assume for a second one such sector is going to be the clean tech sector, because that is an area that is likely to grow quite substantially in the future. And we have to add in the power sector significant capacity. It's better for all of that to come from clean sources rather than from polluting sources. And for that, we'll require a huge amount of both solar and wind capacity. Now, clearly, we have a choice. We can keep importing it from the cheapest possible source, which today is China. China has successfully outcompeted every country. Most solar manufacturers in other parts of the world have gone bankrupt. And so the question is, what do we need to do in India to set up an industry and a manufacturing industry that can actually compete with the Chinese? So I think number one, we need to obviously have some form of protection, because today that industry does not exist in India, and you're competing with companies that are much, much larger, have significant investments on the R&D side, have significant momentum behind them. So we need to therefore, to create the industry, we need to give a clear degree of protection, and protection for a certain and considerable period of time, to make sure that there is enough of a roadmap and a runway for new companies to start off in India, which automatically then would mean the prices, for example, of the end product to the end customer are going to rise, obviously, because we're then going to be having a higher tariff in the country. So I think that is one consequence that we all need to understand, because some of these are input industries into other downstream industries. So to that extent, there will be a slightly higher cost in those, and we have to be cognizant of that. Now, as far as capability is concerned, we certainly have the capability in India. And I think once we actually set up these industries, and once, as Mr. Khan said, we are able to give that sense of market size in India, I can assure you that Indian industry will be able to ramp up significantly and get to a point where ultimately in cost, we will not be uncomparative with the Chinese. I think that is something that I think we've shown in various industries, that if we set our mind to it, we are able to get the cost down to a level where we can be globally competitive. I think that same kind of thing is certainly possible in our industry as well. The only thing is that as we transition into this kind of an area or this kind of a system, we have to make sure that whatever we have in the pipeline currently, that does not get affected. And so therefore, if we have a number of options, for example, in our sector that have already happened, and those had already assumed that there would be imports of modules from the cheapest source, which is in this case China, then those projects and those tenders need to be protected. And in any case, you'll need 2 years for domestic manufacturing capacity to be set up. So to that extent, you have to protect and create this very clear transition roadmap. And I think if you can do that and give a very clear transition map into how these duties will come in and how long they will be there for, you will just see that given the size of the Indian market, a number of investments will start coming into the market. And that, I think, is the best way to create the ecosystem, best way to create the economies of scale, and create an industry that eventually is able to compete with the Chinese, not just in India, of course, but also in global markets.
Okay, Sumant, I'm going to stay with you. Do you think that what COVID has done is, even as it has disrupted business and affected millions of people, affected lives, livelihoods, it's been a very, very destructive force. But do you think that at the same time, this is perhaps an opportunity to rebuild policies, to rebuild strategies, to refocus priorities, and do things in a way so that, let's say, a few industries in India get a leg up?
You know, I think to some extent that thinking, and perhaps Mr. Kant is a much better person to answer this question than I am, but from whatever I could see, there was already a lot of thinking in that direction going on in the government, even before COVID actually impacted us. And therefore, the whole aspiration around Make in India and so on, which is now got coupled now with the Atmanirbhar Bharat campaign as well, which is around building a stronger India. I don't think it's about necessarily only building an import substitution in India, but I think it's much more about building a stronger India, an India which is much more self-reliant. And I think, therefore, that taking over or hastening the move towards identifying what those sectors are, putting some sense of urgency within the government machinery, within the corporate sector, to move faster in that direction, I think that is something that certainly is now happening. That realization is, I think, a lot stronger. And so I think in some ways, we're going to get there a little bit faster because of COVID. And that's a bit of an odd thing to say, but I can see that COVID seems to have sharpened people's minds about what needs to be done for the future. And I think also when you couple along with that, this whole issue with China, I think it's made the future course of action very, very clear. And I'm sure Mr. Kant can throw really good light on that.
Mr. Kant, before you add to that, and you mentioned the many advantages and the many gains of globalization. So should we start off by assuming that this is not an end of globalization, but really a rebalancing? Because you had the US and China, which were pretty much dominant economic forces. Do you think what we now have is an opportunity for a few other countries, maybe India, to have a greater role to play in the global economy?
No, I'm pretty sure that this is definitely not the end of globalization. And in fact, this only thing that will happen is that the existing supply chains will get disrupted. New supply chains will get established, and there's an opportunity. Every crisis is an opportunity, and it's very important for India to look at new areas of growth. And I think this will create new winners in the global economy. And therefore, it's very important to understand as to what are going to be the sunrise areas of growth for the future. They will be, to my mind, you will have a huge amount of disruption in the mobility sector. You will have electric mobility coming in. You will have shared and autonomous vehicles coming in. You will have a huge amount of disruption which will take place in the way we, in electrification. A lot of renewable energy with storage will come in, but simply because in India in a very big way because of our commitment towards a cleaner future. You will see a huge amount of disruption taking place in the world of genomics and pharmaceuticals. And to my mind, India is one of the few countries which has huge amount of data at very low cost. We just, the cost of data in India is just 9 cents per 1 GB as compared to $8 in the United States of America. And therefore, India is going to generate vast amount of data. Every Indian is using biometric today. So we have over close to about a billion plus biometrics. We have a billion plus bank accounts, and we have over 1.3 billion mobile phones. And everybody is generating data. So India should move from being merely data rich to being data intelligence. And therefore, a lot of use of artificial intelligence and in areas like judicial interventions and land cases, etc., we are using a lot of blockchain technology, and these will be the sunrise areas of growth for the future. So I think India must clearly now identify about 12, 13 sectors of growth, identify its champion companies, push them to the limit, build up size and scale, do away with antiquated rules and antiquated procedures which hampered ease of doing business, allow them the freedom to fly and penetrate markets in a very, very big way. That's critical. And you will automatically build up the supply chain here.
All right, Mukesh, quickly, because I think one of the points that everyone else was making seems to suggest that what we are seeing now is perhaps a greater congruence of political or strategic interests with economic interests. They were always aligned, but increasingly they are playing a greater role in a lot of decisions, including in the technology space. Right? I mean, India recently barred 59 Chinese apps. The US has consistently called for Huawei to be left out of many network tenders because it is worried that the links between that company and the Chinese government are far too strong to be ignored, and that it might compromise communication networks across the world. How do you see this playing out over time?
I believe that as the geopolitical shift happens, it's an opportunity for India to muscle its way, and I use the word muscle its way, to be on the table rather than being part of the menu. And the reason I say that is today US, India, Europe are globally aligned from their value system. And that value system is that we believe in democracy, openness, we believe equal rights to every citizen. And what you have is China, which is a very much an authoritarian state, a more of a hegemonic, a hard power, when you look at India as a soft power. And that alignment has to be leveraged. And for example, you mentioned technology side, Huawei. In no way, in any manner, India should allow 5G to come into any of its telecom. Yesterday, the UK was threatened by the Chinese ambassador because UK said they will limit Huawei into their environment itself. So what we are seeing is if you don't know how to Chinese way of giving them access, they will threaten. They've done the same thing with the Australians. Stop importing their barley and wines and meats itself. So India has to geopolitically align, muscle its way to the table, and at the same time, leverage the technology aspect. Let me just finish by saying that 59 app is a small thing. It's not a big thing because you look at in China, Google, WhatsApp, Facebook, Uber, everything is banned. There's no international app at all. India is such an open environment. Google, WhatsApp, Facebook, they dominate the local market itself. So it shows the two societies are very, very different. And finally, I just want to say we have to look at going beyond that. Every airport in India, as we discussed it, has a Chinese closed-circuit TV system and software. They can monitor every movement of every passenger coming in and going out because of the technology. So I think India has to look at this much more seriously and go beyond 59 apps and explore global partnership for its own technology advancement.
Dean Janow, I think one of the consensus that has emerged from all the panelists is that globalization is in debt, or at least that's what everyone is saying. But at the same time, if you look at the recommended courses of action, we are hearing about limited protectionism, temporary protectionism, far more closely integrated supply chains, which is pretty much the language of protectionism. It's not really the language of globalization. Can you help us out a little bit here? How do you see this landscape emerging?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating conversation. I'm hearing, very important, I think, area of consensus that the international trading system has been really foundation for global prosperity. At the same time, I'm also hearing some really interesting remarks about a desire to create indigenous industries that are global competitors. And so it raises the question of how do you achieve that? Sumant has made the very compelling case that there is embedded competitiveness in India, but temporary measures are needed to help young industries. And I think we've seen that work and fail in around the world. And so my question on that would be, is it possible to have something that are temporary measures and create in today's world, globally competitive entities coming out the other side? I think the evidence on that is very mixed. And that's not to say it's impossible, but I think it's very mixed. And as you point out, there's a domestic cost to that strategy, especially if it proves hard to lift off those restrictions. It's a moment when I think this digital transformation is offering tremendous opportunities, and Indian firms are very extraordinary in this area, and partnering with foreign firms or allowing foreign firms can accelerate that. I think you're seeing that, and I guess it raises the question, what kind of world do you want to live in? I see that in this area of frontier, a world that allows for interoperability between systems, that allows for data and particularly services flow between the United States and India, will be very mutually beneficial and beneficial to the world. So I would hope as India accelerates down this transformation and will have such unique capabilities, it will do so in a way that allows the world to be part of it and also to contribute to it. That's my hope, because I think there's a tremendous opportunity and growth there. So I think what we're seeing around the world, China has shifted direction. Vaishali mentioned I was at USTR. It was a long time ago, 89 to 93. China was just starting down its path. And it was headed on a path towards much more market-based reforms until really after the great financial crisis of 2008, and it has shifted direction. Now it's making statements about wanting to continue to open, but doing so at a time when the role of the state is getting heavier. And there's been a shift of direction and of the sort that Mukesh has outlined extremely elegantly and comprehensively. So, I think we're seeing a world of contradictions, and we need, I think, for economies to be thoughtful about the interventions that they introduce to promote domestic and allow for continued global growth.
Sure. Your questions can now be posted on the chat function, and we'll post them to the panelists. But I have one final question for Dr. Seth, which is, if you are an entrepreneur in India, like Sumant, for instance, what would your strategy be at this point in time? I mean, at one side, you're seeing your business get disrupted by COVID, but at the other side, you're seeing the significant global realignment of strategic and economic forces and drivers. What would you do? Dr. Seth, I think you're on mute.
There were some dogs barking, so I put myself on mute. I think in industries like Sumant, it is really important to consider the question of what level of economies of scale we're looking at. Now, this is really the tension between globalization and nationalism. It's a hard question. What are we building for? Are we building for the world? Are we building world scale manufacturing capabilities, or are we building national level manufacturing capabilities? And the economies of scale are going to be quite different depending on which these are. Part of the tension that that an entrepreneur like Sumant in his industry would have to consider is how to balance his needs for the domestic market versus the long run needs of the global market, and to be able to put into place a plan that has built in resilience and built in flexibility for for growth. One of my areas of research is real options, and so I think that this is a perfect area, perfect field to think in a real options kind of format. If the world changes in this particular direction, well, this is the way I will proceed, and thus and so on. So that real options logic, which has an inbuilt way of thinking flexibly and with resilience as to how an uncertain future will unfold, is what I would recommend for Sumant. At the same time, it is absolutely critical for all of us to also be thinking about our cost structures in a way that there is sustainability for the future. So when we talked about economies of scale, there's a labor element there. We talked about revamping labor laws. One issue that we have not yet discussed is free trade zones of the kind that China has set up, that perhaps could bring a number of these elements and ideas together in a nice fashion to be able to propel growth without disrupting other parts of the ecosystem. Those would be some recommendations: flexibility, resilience, real options thinking.
Excellent. Okay, we've got some questions, and one of them is a question I wanted to ask myself. So there's a question we have from Sudesh Ramtheke, and it is for Mr. Kan. You mentioned 10 or 12 industries. The way to go would be to pick 10 or 12 industries and say, okay, these are what we should focus on. So Sudesh wants to know, which 3 industry segments do you think the government should immediately focus on for local manufacturing and developing capabilities within India to quickly insulate and de-link ourselves from China?
Let me give you a couple of more, because we do a lot of mobile manufacturing already in India. We need to do greater level of value addition. So I'm a strong believer that Samsung, Apple, all are already here. They can expand further. Mobile manufacturing and electronics is one area. Second, I think in the cutting edge area, the future a lot of this will lie in advanced chemistry, battery manufacturing. This is the area of the future. We should do this. Thirdly, I'm a strong believer that auto components, India has already got a very, very strong base, but we can penetrate global markets in a much, much bigger way. Thirdly, that. And fourthly, I strongly believe that we need to do a greater level of value addition in the pharmaceutical sector. We are the pharmacy of the world, but we need to do much greater level of value addition so as to capture a higher unit value realization. So these are 4 sectors, but I have many more. You can look at labor intensive sectors like textiles and food processing. So these are some of the areas where India can become a global champion.
Okay. There is a question for Sumant. I don't know who it's from. There's increasing rhetoric globally on avoiding Chinese goods and bringing supply chains closer home. Do you think this is practically achievable across sectors and industries? And in which sectors do you see India being able to step up as a credible alternative?
Well, I can't speak to other sectors, but I can speak for my sector. I certainly think in our sector it's possible. And I would, in fact, to Mr. Kan's previous answer, I would add actually the fact that, clean tech is an area that is evolving right now very significantly. And over the next 4 or 5 decades, there is going to be tremendous growth and opportunity. And here is an advantage for us to think a little bit futuristically and try to start building those industries in India from today, so that we don't have the same situation that we're having in solar panels and that we're having in batteries. We were trying to play catch up, starting at a significant disadvantage. So chemistries or the technologies like carbon capture, usage and storage, for example, or hydrogen, using that as in mobility or using that as a storage mechanism, energy efficiency technologies. I think these are all areas in which the world is just at the very initial stages. And these are all areas in which we can actually invest in right now and create long-term advantages on even from this point in time. And if I may just add a comment to what the question that you asked Anju earlier about what if she were an entrepreneur in India right now. Let me just answer that question, since I am an entrepreneur in India right now. Look, the issue is that with what the government is doing and with this whole anti-China sentiment, clearly it offers up tremendous opportunities. And I think all entrepreneurs should be looking at this, the opportunities that are going to be arising from this sort of focus and move towards indigenization very, very seriously. Because I think that there will be opportunities if you have the ability of taking a little bit of risk. And if at the same time, the policies that Mr. Kant talked about in terms of giving incentives, and that can be coupled with some degree of clarity about how long this is going to stay for, if those policies come into place and are sensible, then I think there is no better time than being an entrepreneur in India right now, because you will have a lot of new opportunities.
Okay, question for Mukesh. Sorry, the previous question for Sumant was actually from Srinivasulu Yanamandra, who's a director with Barclays Investment Bank. Mayank Junjunwala has a question for Mukesh, which is, will India decoupling itself from Chinese manufacturing lead to a shift of power towards Western countries? And he doesn't name the US, but I might as well name it, which will probably be a source of finance and new projects, rather than helping Indian companies completely.
No, the answer is no. And the reason I'm saying that is because India is a potential market for most of the Western companies. As the population ages in the West, and the median age in India is around 29, the potential of market growth is tremendous in India, and Western companies will keep on exploring that. You have to understand that, and I just want to come back to the previous question. It is important that when Mr. Kant and other folks are looking at the industries, I just want to add the 4 or 5 industries which are critical, because when the Prime Minister made a statement, be vocal about local, it's not about protectionism, it's about sustainability. And that means you got to be self-sufficient, what we did in 60s on food supply. You got to be self-sufficient in healthcare. You got to be self-sufficient in defense ecosystem. And the next one I would say is focus on digital, because that's the strength of India and we can leverage that. So I think if you partner with Western companies on those 4 or 5 areas, you will see a mutual benefit coming across the Western world and India itself.
Okay, this is for
infrastructure, industries associated with infrastructure.
This is a question which Manogya Prasad has posed, and I'm directing it to Dr. Seth. In the current scenario, how should India go ahead in terms of maintaining its business relationship with China?
No, that's a really interesting question. On the one hand, we have plenty to be concerned about because of the difficulties that China has faced, not just for India, this is for the world. China has created what many perceive to be an uneven playing field that advantages China at the expense of others. And so much of what we're seeing now is a reaction of countries around the world, including India, to try to pull China in a direction that levels the playing field to the extent possible. And I think it's absolutely imperative for countries to work together in a fashion, understanding China's incentives, long-run incentives, are also to cooperate, to not be isolated from the world economy. So we also have to be in the short run concerned about retaliation from China. So proceeding in a cautious fashion to creating that level playing field, while at the same time conscious of the idea that there is potential retaliation, and warding that off is how I think we could proceed.
Okay, I think Mukesh has had to log off because he had another call at 9:30, but I have just one final question, so 2 more minutes, and this is for Dean Janow. How do you think, this is from Anuruddh Kanti, how do you think the Chinese will react to the global opposition to their economic interests? Because it's not as if they're just going to lie back and take it. They can see that there are forces arrayed against them. What do you think their response will be?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. This has been a fascinating conversation, all. I do think that perhaps this conversation has emphasized decoupling more than I would. I think the trade between the United States and China is very substantial and likely to grow under the macro conditions that have been introduced by the United States, as well as imports. I mean, as well as a phase one trade agreement that we didn't much talk about, and it's been disappointing to some, but it does anticipate a lot of additional purchases of agriculture and other matters. So what I think has been a decoupling has been more selective around technology areas where the United States is introducing more speed bumps or hurdles to foreign investment and technology areas. I think China's Belt and Road strategy is an effort to tie the prosperity of global growth to China's own economic activities. And we will see more of that. That is to say, more of an effort by China to use its economic incentives to bring the world into its orbit. I think that will be a powerful instrument for China that it will continue to utilize at every opportunity.
Excellent. Mr. Kant, Dean Janow, Dr. Seth, Sumant, thank you. I'm now handing over to Vaishali.
Thank you, Sukumar. Every crisis is an opportunity. There will be new winners. Don't fear, it's not an end to globalization. We got Mr. Khan's top 10 plus list of industries, auto components, pharma, textiles, food processing, to name just a few. Thank you for that list. Thank you to the distinguished panelists for their encouraging comments. It sometimes seems like gloom and doom, but we take away really a wow kind of a future opportunities which we all should be watching out for. It's not often that we are lucky to hear such an eminent panel. I wish we could have gone on for longer and heard a little bit more from each one of you, but this webinar has to come to an end. Thank you, Sukumar, for an excellent job as a moderator. I'm not sure whether I will choose between your barbecuing skills or moderating, as both are brilliant. I want both of them. So thank you for a great job done. We had a large set of audience participation, Mr. Kant. As always, it's wonderful hearing to your frank, candid comments. Thank you so much for doing this for us.
Great pleasure. Wonderful.
And thank you, Merit. I hope to see you soon. I hope so. We can get on the other side of all this soon. Thank you, Dr. Seth. And Suman, thank you.
Thank you as well, Vaishali.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
IIM Calcutta as well.
Bye.
Yes, thank you to IIM Calcutta. Yeah.
So interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.